Everyone, how's it going? Today I'm going to introduce you to a concept that is probably the best way to get something that looks like a comic or an animation or toon shade, and that is texture painting. Now, it's a topic that I've sort of avoided for a while because I wanted to sort of like ease you in, show you some procedural methods which are really good as an overall base. But sooner or later, you're going to have to UV unwrap something and you're going to have to get your hands dirty and do some actual hand painting. So today, I'm hoping to demystify it a little bit, give you something really simple to look at. I've resurrected this old kind of rock thing that I produced a couple of years back because it's a really simple model to work on, and it will allow us to look at the principles of texture painting and hopefully in a very easy to understand way. So what I've got here is a rock with two materials, okay? There is rock 1, which is this sort of light tan, and this rock 2, which is sort of like a darker tan. And so these materials basically have been applied to faces procedurally, just by sort of clicking on the face and then just going assign. And that will assign the material to that face. Now we're going to do something similar, but we are going to sort of take this to the next level. Now I'm going to go over to my outliner here, and I'm going to hide my old cliff face, and I'm going to show you something that is untextured. It's basically got no materials whatsoever, and we're going to begin the process of texture painting. Now it begins with a UV unwrap. So the first thing I'm going to do is go over to my UV editor because we want to look at the UVs, and here is my 3D viewport. We don't really need materials right now, but we will need this screen in a moment. So I'm just going to maximize our screen real estate here. And with my monolith selected, I'm going to go into Tab. And if everything isn't selected yet, just hit A and then hit U to bring up our Unwrap menu. Okay. Now let's just take a look at this for the moment. Now I've got this thing called Live Unwrap tick. Now this is a really useful thing to have on because as you modify your unwrap, it will automatically update it on the UV unwrap window over here, which we're currently looking at a square. You might have nothing, but this is going to change momentarily. So and I'm just going to hit unwrap. Now there is no seams on this, and so it's basically giving us the best approximation of how Blender would go about by flattening all of the surfaces on this particular model. Now, I purposely modeled this with no base because, for one thing, a subsurface modifier means that nothing would sort of like creep underneath. I wouldn't have to put an edge there. But also, if you unwrap this, it will have an open edge and makes unwrapping a lot easier. Now, there's a couple of modes in Unwrap that you can take a look at. First off, let's take a look at Smart UV Project. If you click on that, okay, we get this angle limit, which is basically the angle before it begins to split off a bunch of faces. Island margin gives us a space between all of the islands that it will produce on our UV unwrap. I don't really look at area weight at the moment, so I'm just going to leave that to 0. And then I'm just going to hit OK. Now you'll see that a lot of little objects appear over here, right? And they might be easier to look at by corresponding them. You can sort of see, okay, maybe that's the top area. These are some of the faces over here, but let's try something else. Let's go cube projection. What cube projection does is it tries to estimate what this looks like from a bunch of sides. And here we've got a very weird cube projection. Let's see if we reset that and now do a cube. No, it still gives us a bit of a weird thing. Cylinder projection tries to unwrap it as if it was a cylinder, and you can see that the top here is really kind of skewing off. Sphere projection does something similar, and all this really does is it tries to assume that the shape has got a primitive of sphere, cylinder, or cube, and then tries to stretch out the UVs to match that. And then, of course, there's stuff like project from view, which means that this is the view, and so this is how all the faces are projected onto the UV unwrap. I'm going to just do a normal unwrap, And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create what's known as a seam. So I'm going to select, I'm just going to go into edge select mode by hitting keyboard 2. I'm going to go Shift Alt, and I can select this edge that's running down the side here. Okay. Then I'm going to select Shift Alt, this edge here, this edge here, this edge here, okay, and I'm going to leave this one alone. Now, all of those edges, I'm now going to go Control E, mark seam, right? Now, when I go and select everything, you'll see that everything has been unwrapped in a different way. You'll see that because I've got this live unwrap thing, it means that it just automatically updates it. And this is sort of what we want. We can sort of see that these correspond to the 4 sides of our monolith, and this corresponds to the top, almost like it's been, cut open and sort of flattened out. And that's basically what UV unwrapping is. Now, I'm not going to go ahead and try to massage these in any meaningful way, because this unwrap will work for our purposes. So that's as far as I'm going to take UV unwrapping. It's actually quite simple once you get your head around it, and this is going to make life a heck of a lot simpler for texture painting. So let's get on with texture painting now. So I'm going to go from object mode to texture paint mode, okay? And you'll see that in our UV unwrap, we get this sort of grayed out version of our unwrap over here. But what I want to do is go up to our new context settings over here, because we can actually see our texture painting tools and all that sort of stuff right here, which is actually a little bit easier to handle. Now, if you don't have this top bar, okay, it says text draw, a color, radius, all that, that's because it hasn't been enabled in tool settings, okay? So by default, you might have this. If you need those tool settings, just go into View and then just go Tool Settings, and there we've got our tool settings up here where we can see them. But these will correspond a little bit to over here as well. And so the first thing we want to do is create a texture. So where it says no texture, I'm going to hit plus, and I'm going to create a base color. Now, this time I'm going to make my width and height a lot bigger, because I want this to create a texture map that can be viewed fairly reasonably close up. The closer you're going to get to an object, the larger you want your texture to be, okay? 1024 isn't going to cut it if you're going to get your camera right in there, because you're going to start seeing all the pixelation and the stretching of the UV unwrap on the surfaces themselves, right? The edges of your model will render crisp and clear, but you're talking about an image that's been then plastered onto your object, and that's got to also have resolution as well. So I'm going to bump this up to 4096, something nice and high. I'm going to leave this color as black, and I'm going to leave the generation type as blank. So now this is called a material base color, which over in the UV unwrap, I can now select the material base color, and you'll see that there it is with the unwrap, and it's got our black color. Now, I normally like to work in a very dark tone for this, because if I was to say work on the base color for the beginning, it just means that I won't know where if I was just looking at the texture, where the cutout, as it were, was. So now what we want to do, obviously, is to fill this up. But first, I have to draw your attention down here to my shader editor, and you'll see that automatically it's created a material for us, and it consists of 3 things. It consists of the material base color, okay, that we've just generated. It's generated a texture inside of Blender. It's got a principled shader, which we don't really need, and then it's got a material output so we can see anything that is going to be mapped on to our object. Now, we're working in cycles. I don't really need the principled base shader, so what I'm going to do is something a little bit clever here, because it works in 2.8. I'm just going to connect the color to the output. get rid of the shader altogether, and you'll notice that we now have no shading information there. Now, if you do need some shading or something like that, maybe throw in a diffuse shader. It's a little bit more lightweight, and so you'll actually see some shadows. But in 2.80, you don't really need to do that, and we do really just want to see the colors because this is for toon shading after all. So we've got brush, we've got a color selected. It probably is going to be black, but this is one that's sort of like in preset, and a bunch of other stuff we don't really need to look at the moment, because the first thing I'm going to want to do is completely fill this object. Now, by default, texture draw means that if I draw my brush across the surface, you'll see that it fills where I painted. Now, I have set my fall off to this, which is basically absolute, because I do want a block color for now. Now, take a look at what happened over at the UV Unwrap thing, okay? We now have some color showing up on the corresponding faces. So we can already see that these faces correspond to this. And because the seam was down this edge, my mistake, I should really put this around the back edge, but let's just work with this. You can see that it will basically follow on correctly onto its opposing unwrapped edge. But what I want to do is fill this, okay? I want to fill it once, and because I want to work fast and I want to work precisely. So in my left-hand tool menu, we've got our brush selections, and one of these is fill. So I'm going to click on that, and now when I click on the object, I have to click a few times because it'll just brighten it up every time, okay? We get the color filling the entire object, and this is a real time saver for the beginnings of creating a basic toon unwrap. I'm just going to go back into object mode for a second, and if I was to take a look at this collection over here, next thing I want to do is obviously get these nice striations in there. And so one thing that we can do is actually select faces and use them as a mask when texture painting. So let's say that this is our base color. Now I'm going to go over into edit mode, and I'm going to set it to faces. And we're going to go ahead and select a bunch of bands here. Now, the way I do this is it's a bit of a keyboard mash, Shift, Control, Alt, and select an edge. And that selects an edge ring. But because we're in face select mode, it will select all the faces in that ring, and you can see the corresponding faces show up on our UV Unwrap. Let's select a few more. So now we've selected a bunch of bands here that we want to texture a different color by applying that fill operation once again. So we go back into texture paint mode. Now we can change the color. I can't just go ahead and hit fill because this is going to blanket fill everything. We haven't enabled a mask yet. Now, because in edit mode, we've got these faces selected and they still show up, tab back into texture paint. This icon over here, paint mask, face selection masking for painting. We click on that and now our masks show up. With our fill, we can now click couple of times, okay, and now when we go into object mode, there we have, it's showing up a little bit, this sort of, you might get this problem a little bit, and it's with this sort of fill operation. We are, in our next step, going to fix this. I'm just going to save my file before we get into the specifics of texture painting, and this is where I really stress you need to get a Wacom tablet to do some drawing. And I'm going to show you two ways of drawing onto this mesh. Now, the first way, let's go back into texture paint mode and let's take off mask. We're going to go into draw mode. Now, I'm going to switch from UV editor mode on this window to my image editor. And this is because that it's got a selection where we can go from view to paint. And another thing we can do is we can hide the texture painted UVs. okay, which will make it a little bit simpler to paint as well. Now, the thing about this mode is that we also have these brushes that correspond to the brushes here. So we've got basically two windows on which we can paint in a similar way, but two different methods. So let's begin by going into 3D mode. Now, much like grease pencil or anything else, you've got radius, you've got strength, and you've got these pressure sensitivity buttons. I definitely want it for radius. I don't particularly need it for strength because I want my strength to be at 100%. I'm also going to make my radius about 25. That's a nicer thing. And with this color selected, I can now paint directly on the surface, and I can, because I want to clean this up a little bit, it's going to allow me to fix up these problem areas, but also give it a bit of a hand-painted look, right? Because we don't want this super smooth. We want this quite nice and bumpy. Now, if you don't like going round and round your model, okay, sort of fixing things up bit by bit, there is another way, and that way is to paint on this surface. So you can already see where we've begun to paint, and we can actually paint in along these lines, and this will actually help get rid of some of that jaggedness that we sort of see in our result, right? And so if you prefer to paint on a 2D surface, you've got this option, but if you prefer to paint on a 3D surface, you also have the other option. Now, both have got their pros and cons. Because this is an unwrapped surface, watch what happens if I was to say paint over, say this edge over here. Okay, I'm going to swing this around to where we have our seam. You can see that the seam here is really showing up, and that's where you sort of need to go into your 3D viewport and sort of do a little bit of touching up. The other thing, of course, that I would like to do is to add more toon detail, and the stuff that I want to do is put some like nice more wavy striations in there, some circles, and sort of really sell that this is sort of a rock. So let's start with the reverse. Okay, let's start in the darker areas because we've got our lighter color here. Now I can use my bracket tool, my left bracket, to decrease the brush, or right bracket to increase the brush. So I'm going to decrease it to something nice and small. And let's say I'm going to put a little mark over here so I know that that's where we're at over here. I'm now just going to draw a very nice fine line across there. Now you can already see that I'm showing up the crease edge over here because I'm never actually going to get a perfect paint on this. But the beauty of this is that you can then paint on the 3D surface. Let's get that. And correct your painting. So that it matches up seamlessly. So basically I've just jumped ahead to just adding a bit more detail, doing a bit more cleanup, using our two methods. And you sort of like, you can see that this drawing is really starting to take shape, and it's starting to look like a nice toon style of rock. And there's still a couple of areas that might need a little bit of cleanup. And I thought I'd use that opportunity to tell you a little bit about some of the brush settings that you have at your disposal. So let's take a look at some of the ones here in your texture context tools. Okay, so if we went down a little, you can see that you can change your stroke to a different type of method, okay, depending on what you need. Space seems to be the nice default. And you can even change the pressure so you can get a really nice even stroke, and that comes in very handy for cleaning up these problem areas when we're sort of drawing on here. Now, one of the reasons that it begins to distort in certain parts is because some of the faces are actually stretching the texture. Okay, and there's not a lot you can do to avoid that unless you sort of have to put in a lot more information in there so you can sort of avoid or reduce the stretching. And now the spacing here is set to 10%. That's pretty good, but if we sort of bumped that up, what would happen is that you'd actually see the space between the dots that you're painting. So you sort of want to bring that down to as low as possible without making your machine grind to a halt. And then you want to sort of change your input sample to something that is, see, an input sample of 1 is very inaccurate, but you can sort of bump that up a little bit, and then suddenly your input sample gives you a smoother result when fixing that. Now, in this instance, what I'm probably going to have to do is going to have to find the happy medium. Okay, so that seems to be where the face doesn't stretch so much. So let's just color that in like so. And I think the opposite is true for here. Yep. Okay, so it's just a little higher than what we had. Okay. Using those tools, you can quickly clean up your texture paint. But once you've got your texture painting sort of where you want it to be, we've got a rock face that looks really, really good, and now it's ready to render. Now, as I've shown you in a previous video, the method that I like to use for rendering is to have a diffuse material in there to catch shadows and then render out your diffuse pass. So I'm going to go ahead and set that up. Okay, under my view layer properties, I'm going to click color on diffuse. I'm going to make sure that under my filter, we don't really need freestyle for this one, ambient occlusion, environment, or hair. We just need surfaces. And we do want a shadow pass. Okay, so we've got color, shadow. Let's just close down this window over here so we can sort of see what we're going to be rendering. In our object shader editor, Shift A, shader, diffuse. Okay, so we can get some shading information in there. So if we were to render, you'd sort of see that this is what we get. Our light, let's just get out into object mode, sorry. Our light, let's set our angle to 0 because this will give us a really nice sharp shadow. And we do want some texture on that. Now let's go over into our compositor where we should have a renders layer panel and a composite, and I'm just going to do a quick render on that. Now your total image looks a little dark, okay, but that's because what we really want is our diffuse color information to come through first and foremost, okay, and so there it's looking very much like a cartoon. Of course, the alpha channel doesn't get correctly knocked down, so what we want to do is go Shift A, converter, set alpha, and we're going to set that alpha to the image, and then we're going to throw in a mix RGB node to bring in our shadow information, set on a multiply. And you can already see that those shadows are starting to really fill in those gaps, but we want something that's a little bit more stark and prominent. So I'm going to rotate this lamp around so that it's, let's see if we can sort of see the entire thing here. Let's rotate it around so we got to sort of get half of the object in shadow. And let's just do another render there, okay? Because this is going to work a lot better for our purposes. And there, we're starting to really see something that looks more cartoony. Now we can just drop that factor back ever so slightly, and now we're starting to get something that looks like a really nice toon rock. I'm just going to delete this plane here, just so we can get the toon on its own when we do a render, because I'm going to do one more thing, and that is give it an outline. And that again is done very, very simply. I'm going to duplicate this set alpha. I'm going to Drag that alpha over there, and I'm going to bring in a dilate erode filter. And I'm going to set that to distance. Let's get that about 3. This is a really cheap way of getting a good outline on your object. So I'll just do a quick re-render of that. So we've just got the Toon Rock asset. Bring this down here. And because it's going to be the diffuse color over the top, let's just duplicate that one, set that to mix, and put this in the second operation at 100%. And drag that down at the bottom. And now you can sort of see that we get this nice edge line that we can increase or decrease or whatever. And then finally, all we really need is a background image to alpha over it. And we can just use another mix node. That's not a problem. What we do is just set that on the second operation and that on the first. But now what we need to do is find an image. So I'm just going to go over to some nice clouds here, for instance. And I'll just adjust my camera so it's looking up at the rock. And so like we can't really see any kind of ground. Let's try to get as much in there as possible. And once again, do one final render. Now the reason it's rendering so quickly is because I've dropped my samples extremely low. And that's fine for toon shading because all you want to do is get some color information. And there you have it. Okay, we've done a little bit of texture painting to get this rock looking really nice. This will make a really nice background element for a comic or illustration, and it also works for animations and stuff like that. But you can already see how those shadows play really nicely on the topology of this rock, and that we've got these nice hand-painted textures that we've put in there completely inside of Blender. Okay, I hope you got a lot out of this, guys. Thanks for watching. This is Paul signing off. Bye for now.